Well, welcome to the Reach Australia Learning Labs. Today we're going to be looking at an aspect of the ecosystem, Godward attentiveness or Godward responsiveness. And today we're joined with Andrew Hurd, the senior pastor or lead pastor at EV Church on the Central Coast, and also one of the founders of Geneva Push and Reach Australia. And also Ray Galea, who is the senior minister at MBM Rooty Hill. It's great to have both of you join us today. Welcome.
Great, good to be here.
Now, this is going to be a really interactive learning lab. So for those of you who are joining us now and here, I want to encourage you to be asking questions through it. We'll have a number of pauses and blocks where you'll be able to interact. But for the first part, we're going to hear from Andrew just sort of setting the scene, and then Ray really pushing into why this is an important area and why we need to single this out for church life. And then they'll have a bit of a discussion, and then I'll be pulling in questions from you as well. So just as you're listening in and hearing in, can I encourage you just to be throwing your questions in there, and I'll try and get most of those through the course of today's session. So Andrew, I just want to throw to you the ecosystem. Tom's going to put up the Pentagon slide that we affectionately know. You talk about the importance of keeping the big thing in front of people, making mature disciples. But then what does that look like here in the ecosystem for the individual and for the whole church as well? And can you just pull out the importance of ecosystem in church life?
Yeah, so there's two big things we want to achieve. We want to see people won for Christ, and we want to see people matured in Christ. So, we think of that as kind of get, grow. But they do relate to each other. So they're not two independent activities, as if we can just pursue evangelism, reaching Australia, and independently of that pursue evangelism and maturing of people and deepening their faith. The two actually work together because the simple principle is healthy things grow. And if we can produce a healthy community of believers in every dimension of our life and world together, that becomes powerfully attractive, but also becomes compelling for people within that community to want to go and get others to be part of this thing called Jesus, this work around Jesus. And so the whole thing all works together, and we've tried to picture this with this Pentagon drawing, which is if we can have a community of believers who are deep in the Word, who are growing in their understanding of God and their insight into things of Christ, if we can have them doing that together in a community where they love one another, where they're serving one another, where the gifts of God are exercised wonderfully and freely and sacrificially, but also if we can do that in a context where an understanding of God, a knowledge of God, gives itself over into affections for God, delight in God and rejoicing in Him, and praise and song that comes out of a heart full of love for God, then mission, the other piece on the Pentagon, will happen. We'll see people drawn to this community and people in this community empowered and encouraged to go out. And so one of the things we keep wanting to offer is that reaching Australia and growing people is not two things, it's one big thing together, and paying attention to the whole is important.
Now, Andrew, during the conference, we talked about how it's the whole ecosystem that actually disciples. It's not one structure. We'll talk, during the course of this learning lab about the gathering as a champion structure for this Godward attentiveness area. But during the conference, you mentioned a bit of data that you captured from the NCLS survey tool, and just highlighted just in this next slide that we value preaching and we value small groups. Yet you made the point that we're actually not seeing greater spiritual growth comparatively to the rest of our Protestant, brothers and sisters.
Some of whom may not be brothers and sisters, but yes, and that's part of the concern, is that the group we're comparing ourselves here to will have many believers within it, of course, but many who have given up on the gospel and aren't actually spirit-filled people at all. And so that our results, if you like, the evidences of our health as a Christian community is not particularly different, is concerning. So this slide first shows you, we're the group that our world do value preaching and Bible teaching. But if you look at the next slide, it does demonstrate that things aren't very different to others who attend church. And many of whom are, I mean, don't misunderstand, many of whom are wonderfully converted and so on. But you can see there the grey and the red. So the grey is all Protestants, liberal, given up on the gospel, but also, charismatic Pentecostal, many of whom are believers, not all, but you've got the differences aren't great. So that for all our commitment to preaching and Bible studies, the preaching in our churches by and large is not any more helpful. And our growth in understanding God in church is not much more than any other church. And growth in faith is not much more. So these things are a great warning shot across the bow about how we're going. And interestingly, inspired during services is much lower. Now, how much that's got to do with the way our culture thinks about inspiration and so on is a key question, of course. But the black is just a few churches bundled together to give the indication that it doesn't have to be this way, that many within our Reformed evangelical tradition are seeing significantly different results. Point being, it's not the soil. There's something I want to offer. I think we've got very well-trained leaders, theologically deep and astute. I think there's a series of systemic issues running through our culture that are impeding our ability to make a difference in people's lives like we ought. And I do think one of those things that's impeding our ability to make a difference is the way we think about our public gatherings, the way we think about affections for Christ, public expression of these things, what happens in our services and so on. Because that's a piece that is part of the whole ecosystem that makes a difference in spiritual life.
So that's really the helpfulness of the ecosystem thinking, is that you start thinking into these areas of church life and thinking at the high level as they build into the larger outcome of actually making mature disciples. Ray, if I can bring you in, I guess one of the questions a lot of people have as they sort of unpack, Godward attentiveness or Godward responsiveness is what is it? So can you define how you conceive and how you think about Godward responsiveness in the ecosystem?
Can I firstly apologise for the Jag look that I've got? It looks like I'm from an episode of Jag with that romantic feel. But I'm really wanting to highlight one aspect, and that is if you don't have your lighting right at church, it too intrudes in the experience and gets in the way of the personal experience. So even in this negative example, I'm already teaching you. So how's that? By the way, just on the survey, we survey every year, so we don't wait for NCLS. So we've got a set of questions we run the whole congregation to, because you know what it's like. Today you're running well in this area, then the wheels fall off, and you pick up too late in your evaluation. So that data is really precious to us, but we'll get back to that later. So for us, MAG is kind of defined this way. I think it's on the screen. So I might just read it out, just draw everyone's attention to it. Have you got it on the screen there, Scott? Or who's ever
Tom will pull it up as you start reading.
Yeah, it's the introduction to the paper. Look, and I'd rework the paper now, but essentially, this was my opening. Magnification seeks to highlight the fact that the reason we exist and the highest motive for the Christian is the glory of God and enjoying him. So, it's the opening to the Westminster Catechism. You know that, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him. And really wanting to put that as the highest good and the highest goal. Magnification of God attentiveness is concerned to nurture not just the mind and the will, which I think we're strong on as evangelicals, but the affections of God's people. And can I just say, that's probably the American tradition. Jonathan Edwards has probably spoken into that in a much more acute way, but nurture the affections of God's people towards our glorious Lord and Saviour. It longs for hearts of God's people to find their greatest pleasure in God's pleasure. It's the thing about being born again and regenerate. He does give you spiritual taste buds to love what he loves and hates what he hates. A healthy Christian finds his or her highest joy in exalting God, both corporately and importantly individually. So remember, we're not just talking about Sunday gathering. MAG framework, we're actually thinking 24/7, of which for me, the high point is the gathering, but it is about all of life. I think one of the big issues is trying to wrestle with affections and what they are in art. I came across this article just actually this morning, just to distinguish. There's an expert on Jonathan Edwards, and he just talked about the difference between affections and emotions. And the guy said affections are more than emotions, but they're not less than them. And he just distinguished them this way. A strong inclination of the soul that are manifested in thinking, feeling, and acting. And then distinguishes affections from emotions. Affections long-lasting, emotions fleeting. Affections deep, emotions superficial. Affections consistent with beliefs, emotions sometimes overpowering. Affections always result in action. Emotions often fail to produce action. Affections involve mind, will, and feelings. Emotions, feelings often disconnected with mind and will. The interface between our affections and God's glory is what we want to bring in. And I think this is an element of our maturing that actually has not got enough voice into it. And I'll talk a little bit later just about what happens when we don't accent magnification of God, attentiveness. And it is, remember, for me, the ecosystem, that the way Andrew puts it together, is to me gathering what kind of church do we want to present to Jesus on the last day? What does maturity look like? What's the end goal here? And this is the piece that actually I think is most neglected by evangelicalism. And I think we run into deism and rationalism if we don't have this one front and center for us.
Do you think, I'm going to jump in, Scott, if you don't mind. Do you think, how much is the language of convictions helpful too, in that convictions sort of speak to a sense in which it's not just I believe something, but I'm convinced and convicted of something. It's joined together with an effective element, would you say?
I tell you why it is good, because sometimes people say, oh, the preacher wasn't passionate. And then I've been thinking about using passion like for a time in preaching, and I thought, you look at Simon Manchester, you look at Archie Poulos, two people I know, they've got very different emotional ranges. They've got very different, but both have conviction. And it kind of avoids the emotional, we've got personalities that are different, and you don't want to just kind of fall into, it has to look like this for someone to be convicted. And so, Andrew, I actually, the more I think about it, the more I like conviction, because that's the word I want to go for when I'm teaching preachers, that how you preach, if you're not demonstrating conviction, then you're already telling me you don't believe and are not endorsing what you're saying, talking about hell like you're talking about the football,
So, and it's the difference between knowing what's good and loving what's good, isn't it? I have strong convictions around this, is it?
Yeah. It's the difference between, it's funny, the different types of marriages, the marriages which are clinical and the marriages and they're ticking boxes, but there's a dimension where there's the display of words of love to one another that's missing. It feels two-dimensional. And the Bible, especially Hebrew and the Hebrew worldview, is just holistic. And we're trying to bring the whole of it. We want to love God with our whole heart, mind, and soul and strength. And the heart, when you break down the data on what the heart is, there's a lot of them refer the heart, the inner person's either speaking to the mind, sometimes it's speaking to the will, sometimes it's speaking to the emotions, and it will be comprehensive. And all of that is what we want to hand over to God, and become the vehicle by which we give him treat him with the honor he deserves. Individually.
It's interesting. It's interesting. Murray Capel, who spoke at the last Reach Australia conference, but is down in the Reformed Theological College in Victoria. He, in his book called Preaching with Spiritual Vigour, I think it is, an old book now, but he characterises the human heart as having four faculties. It's got, at the top, he says, there's the mind, there's the intellect. But coming down into the heart is the will and the conscience. And at the very base, the bottom of the heart, are the passions, the affections, the convictions. And And he would offer that the Puritans recognised these four faculties and actually ministered to it. So they saw that the way to the bottom you're after is not just intellectual assent, but you want to get to the bottom of the heart where the passions are captured, where convictions are gripped, where affections and so on, as Ray's expressed. You want to get to the bottom of the heart, but the only way through to the bottom is through the mind. Mm. You've got to go through the intellect to transform the mind, Romans chapter 12, to change the conscience, to change the will, to impact the affections. And if you short circuit the mind towards affections, you end up creating emotionalism or legalism. You end up with kind of rationalism, these kinds of dangers and so on. Yeah.
So Ray, you've talked about cultivating this with the preachers that you're mentoring and coaching. How do you both cultivate this response personally in your own life?
I just think, we've got a value at MBM, a conscious that we don't do pretend. And it's kind of like that personally as well. Like with God, I've got to cast all my cares before him. I want to let him speak. I want his truths to impact me and give expression to all of who I am. That loves all of me, loves all of you. Well, actually, that's true that's what I want in relation to God. I don't think it quite works with human beings, but all of me wants to love all of God. And whether it's letting his the wonder of who he is, stir the emotions within me, that at times bring me to tears in my quiet time, at times make me want to sing songs of praise. And for that to happen, I have to create space. And I know there are seasons where I just go through the motions, ticking boxes, and you get away with it short term, but I just feel like I certainly miss out, and I'm not giving God my undivided attention. Yeah.
So Andrew, I might just Sam's asked a really good question. This is great for the senior pastor, but he's thinking about his team. Maybe I can ask you this team question, Andrew. How do you cultivate this amongst your team and across the key leaders in your whole church?
Yeah, there are various dangers to watch out for. So I do want to, as you try.
I'm going to get there. That was going to be my next question.
As we cultivate this amongst a team of people, a congregation of people, it needs to be done with some care. Yeah. So we'll come to those. Okay. But what we've done here in this place is, we're a bunch of emotionally stunted humans who all gather together. So we've got our problems and what have you. But we've spent a lot of time talking about it together. And as a team, we've had long conversations around the variety of emotional responses, what's happening for us, why do big things not impact us deeply, do they have to look like they're impacting us deeply, these kinds of questions about how it should look for us and so on are part of the puzzle as well. But for me, that one of the keys has been finding people who have a very clear-minded understanding of the gospel, but are open with their affective dimension. Most of us who have gone through, certainly university contexts, tend to be very much more comfortable with rational debate and discussion. But trying to find people who push me a little in this area, and I've always brought them into the team. I've always tried to have them walk with me, have them walk with us, bring their perspective and bring their heart. And find ways to nurture and encourage that in them and so others. Watch out negative language. I think one of the dangers for us is we can see the problems elsewhere where there's a hyper emotionalism, and we can often so regularly warn against that the people who actually just want to express real joy feel that they can't. And we've noticed that on the team. So I have to watch myself to give freedom to people to express themselves differently than I might.
Ray, just before we look at the dangers, any things you want to add?
Oh, look, when I work with the staff, look, I'm interested in their personal walk with Christ, because it's going to flow from there, isn't it? It all flows from the heart. So there was one staff member, I was really concerned about his time with the Lord and what was taking place or not taking place there. And his doctrines were right. And, he could tickle, you could just feel like he was faith and repentance, but you always felt like there was something kind of missing, and it's just journeying with him about that and having the conversation so that it's part of me discipling him. Includes it, whether it's for others, you don't need to do it as much, but it was the missing piece for me. And when he kind of grew in that area, it affected his preaching, and people appreciate his preaching more. So I think it's part. If you've got a framework for it, then as part of your discipleship, without wanting to be legalistic, because I want people to. I want the truth through their personality. I can't preach like Andrew Hurt. I can't. He's a different dude to me. I thank God for him.
Fortunately.
So we're just, but I know he's, I see his convictions about the things of God. Like, it's so clear to me. He might be slightly different demonstratively to me, because I'm Maltese and can't stop moving my hands. But and I don't want him to be me, and I'm sure he doesn't want me to be him. But it's got
I want to be you, Ray.
Trying to help people be who they are often, without repentance aside. I don't want to lose their humanity in the experience and bring their humanity as it interfaces with the gospel. So there's kind of, I know it's a cliche, but so there's a degree of authenticity going on, rather than, say, when we're preaching, shoveling information,
That's really helpful.
This is good. Can I just offer another little thought here? There is a truth that can be pushed too far, but there is a truth that spiritual maturity and emotional maturity have connections.
Yeah.
And the reality is that if you don't pay attention to what's happening for you emotionally, it will impede your ability to engage at a spiritual level with the things of God, because they're not just truths, they're relational truths. They're truths that are big. And so how do you grow emotionally? How do you pay attention to your own emotional health? That actually, as Ray says, is a discipleship thing, and for us as leaders, it's beginning to be alert to our emotions. What triggers us? Why are we not responding? Why are we responding a different way? What's happening for us? To pay attention to those things becomes, just as a human discipleship growth is important, and to be with people who are having different emotional reactions. All of that's important, to be aware of yourself in it all.
And not be legalistic, because that's the danger. We're knocking on that door. Yeah. I want people free to move their hands and not move their hands. I hated the culture that says many years ago, I said, put up your hand. This is a small staff meeting of about 10 at the eight. And I said, put up your hand if you would like to raise your hands in the service. Just curious. And no one did it then. And 9 out of the 10 put up their hand. I said, this is shocking. We've created another law, a
culture.
Yes, because that equals charismatic, and we're not charismatic, so it's ridiculous, especially when the text is saying that. So I just want to create a culture that's permissive and giving, and allows people to have that freedom to do it, and not judge another brother or sister by a certain level of demonstrative behaviour. We had actually a student minister, Steve Sheen. He preached for us. He's Anglo, and the evening congregation at Fairfield was all Middle Eastern, Mediterranean. He didn't move his hands when he preached the first time. No one could listen to him. We were all distracted. How could he talk and not move his hands? But he actually, I had to give him feedback as just for our sake, he needed to move his hands so he wouldn't distract with it. That was just a cultural communication issue, let alone anything else.
Right.
He did.
Right. That's really helpful. You've highlighted one of those dangers, the danger of legalism. That's a really helpful way to sort of kick off into what are some other dangers in highlighting this area?
It's worship. Sunday is gathering is worship, and forget the rest of the time. That's almost the big one for me. So I want to say it's our high point. We're giving expression to our heavenly assembly reality here on earth, as we're corporately gathered as the family of God around the gospel of our Lord, around Christ through his gospel. But I do not want to, I just can't stand the concept of anyway eroding what 24/7 is what worship is. So that's my big fear, really. Yeah.
I've got 5. Ready for this? So the 5 dangers I said. You've got you've got mysticism, you've got externalism, emotionalism, judgmentalism, and man-centeredness. So I think as you push down encouraging individuals and corporate to pay attention to not just their affective life, their convictions, their heart, but also to the way they might externalize that, you've got the problems of mysticism. The charismatic Pentecostal movement is very often gone full tilt into mysticism, where the experience of emotion is the way I connect to God, rather than through the word by faith in that word. And so mysticism is a very big danger, and humans are prone to it. You know, external, I can't remember the order I offered, but externalism, which creates judgmentalism, as Ray's saying. So the genuine test of whether I'm a mature Christian is how I look. No. The genuine test of how mature I am as a Christian is, do I seek to obey God on Monday? You know, so for me, the worshipping church, the big evidence for us here, the big measure for us whether we're a worshipping church, is whether I'm hearing our 20-year-olds at parties, are they the ones who clean up after the party? You know, are they the ones who meet with the unlovable? Are they the ones who are keeping the marriage bed pure? You know, they're the big tests of the worshipping church. And so the danger is externalism. You turn the evidence of maturity into how you look when you sing, you know, how you move and so on. I might just add, though, on that one, there is one big external that I think is evidence of maturity. And it's worth noting this. The Bible nowhere tells me what to do with my body except for one part of my body, and that's my tongue. And so in the New Testament, I am commanded to sing to one another, making melody in my heart to the Lord. And so I can put on people, if you aren't singing so that I can hear it, there's a maturity issue. It may not be that you don't put your hands up, but you know, there is an externalism, expression of the heart that comes out to us in song that does matter. So mysticism, externalism, which leads to judgmentalism. Man-centeredness, I think there's a problem with man-centeredness in that we end up formulating a way of doing church that's shaped by what people want, not what God wants from us. And so there's the praise and worship movement has nurtured a passion amongst people to have a certain church because they like it that way. We do need to watch man-centeredness too. Rationalism, I think, is a danger too. That we end up reducing the Christian faith to what I think and what I think alone. So there's various dangers that we need to watch.
Now, Andrew, you talk often about the importance.
I throw in deism as well. We've got to watch deism. You know, that there's a God. He's not active in this world. You know. Anyway, so I just want to throw that one as another option.
Well, Ray, tell me your thoughts on this, Ray. Is it possible that we've got dangers on two sides of the road? You know, that classic, there's two ditches you can fall into. So on one ditch is externalism, mysticism, emotionalism. But on the other side is deism, rationalism, internalization, where I'm a head on a stick and nothing has to come out. It doesn't matter how I look to others at all. You've got both sides. There's big problems, and pastorally, our task is to keep aware of those two dangers. You know, legalism, license, and navigate between them in a healthy congregational setting.
I think sorry, Scott, one of the issues people have, I think, they don't want to feel like they're hypocrites. If they don't feel like singing, they don't want to sing, and they haven't learned. You can't avoid. You're either going to be a hypocrite to the purposes of God or a hypocrite to your emotions. And they need to understand you need to be a hypocrite to your emotions and be true to your convictions. You know, my emotions may right now at this moment not want. I don't feel like singing. I've just had an argument with the wife. I'm in this zone in the gathering, and but I want to be true to my commitment, that my conviction that Jesus is worth praising and the saints are worth it. I've been called to edify and build them up, and so. I sometimes, because people have got a certain sense of, I'll be a hypocrite if I do something that I don't feel like doing. but that we haven't educated them on that distinction. I got it from Larry Crabb years ago, but I found it helpful.
That's good. And the other thing is that one of the things I found very helpful years ago was to meet with people who genuinely loved the Lord, had a different way of singing than I did. And I found their singing hugely encouraging.
Yeah.
But then I went back into some context, and the way they sang, it was true. They were doing the right thing. And so love, actually, one of the key features of what we do corporately is to concern ourselves with the way I am in a corporate setting and whether it will help or hinder people.
Yeah.
And I do that as a listener. So when I'm sitting listening to preaching, and this is some of the discussions I remember in our team context, to start seeing that externals did make a difference in certain things. So when you listen to preaching, if I as a listener sort of lay back with my eyes closed, I won't help anybody.
Yeah.
And so I work hard to look attentive and to have my Bible and do a whole bunch of external things for the sake of people around me and my own sake. Well, why do when we get to singing, we then cut all of that off and say, don't put externals on us?
Yeah.
No, there is a way of loving people around me, and I need to sing, I need to voice and engage and get my hands out of my pocket. I just think there's some externals that I, as a leader, I now no longer sing with my hands in my pocket, because I just think it looks like I'm blithely doing an activity that I want to encourage people in rather than discourage you.
This is really helpful. I want to get to some of the questions. You guys are just going to keep talking to each other, which is great. But there are people listening in and having some questions. So I just want to, I just want to push you to that, because you talk often about being intentional, being purposeful. Really helpful to have your definition, that sort of drives some of this area at MBM, Ray. One of the questions is how do you keep creating that culture? And you've fleshed out some of those things. You model it. You speak to it with your people. It's the people you have on your team as well. I'm interested just in you leading this, as pastor, as the lead pastor and driving the team, and also probably handing it over to other people. What are some of the things that you're sort of paying attention to regularly? The questions that you're asking amongst yourselves as a staff team? Just a real brief answer, just on that sort of how do you keep pushing into culture?
Well, you just have to review every Sunday. If you're talking about Sunday gatherings, you have to review them every week and pour time into looking at it through the lens of the ecosystem, really.
Yep.
Of which is MAG, and wow, when that person prayed, I feel like they were preaching to me rather than talking to God, that sort of thing. Like, or they were using such long sentences, or they were just, they wrote it in a way that was like an essay rather than coming from their heart. So just picking that little bit, or that song just kind of theologically, that was off the radar, or the tune didn't line. Basically, you're just having to be intentionally going through the ecosystem framework for every gathering, I think. Yeah.
So Marty's asked the question, have you got any suggestions for good ways to give permission for the expression of affections, both from the front and also other avenues?
Certainly modeling. I think that the leaders are modeling. So we've got leaders, our staff does different things. So already we're telling you there's an array of, there's a freedom here. But I do want to pick up on Andrew's point. I had it just on that, your externals can actually affect your internals as well. There's a proverb that says that, I can't quite remember it. I was passive in a counselling session in the old days when I was a marriage counsellor, and my supervisor listening to me said, she said, you're very passive. And then she said, why don't you, oh, that's right, we're being watched in the counselling session. She said, lean forward. Just physically lean forward in the counselling session. All of a sudden, I became proactive. The act of leaning forward changed what was going on and what was coming out of my mouth. So it kind of reinforces Andrew's point. So,
and just to nudge that even a little bit further, we're moving off the question. I'm sorry, but this is, I think, why this part of the ecosystem matters. There's a few reasons why. One is it matters because God is worthy of our wholehearted praise. Bang. You know, we ought to engage in this activity wholeheartedly, like we engage in listening to His word, seeking to be godly, and all other, so on and so forth. But the other reason it matters is because the activity of me participating fortifies my convictions, and it fortifies the convictions of others. There's an experience of not just speaking words, but speaking words with music that's appropriately connected to it, that does something to my inner convictions that I think God intends. And so I fear that one of the problems with our Reformed evangelical world in its measures, so we're seeing that it's not getting great results in terms of people's lives reflecting growth or a love of God and so on. One of the reasons I think is because we've not paid attention to this piece of our work. We've been good on theological answers, but not good on us together fortifying each other and affirming each other in song. There's been very many occasions where I've been amongst senior leaders who have deep convictions, who sing a hymn, let's say, and sing it loudly with deep conviction. And I came out of that stirred, determined to live a godly life. Now, I want to achieve that every week in church. I want the public gathering to be a place where people are stirred to want to love Christ and serve Him. And this piece has a part in all of that.
So we talk about the gathering being, primarily for the believer, edification, but with a view to the unbeliever, but, paying attention to that. The mission outcome area leader is going to be, pushing in on that every time we think about gatherings. What about this question from Jason? Moving, raising hands, it seemed to be odd or a hindrance to the unbeliever or the newcomer within a congregation. And if we want to push it even further, our externals, you've said our externals matter, but how could they become a hindrance to the unbeliever around us? Are they a hindrance to the unbelievers around us?
It doesn't seem to stop the Pentecostal getting lots of unbelievers.
And get this, you get to choose who comes to your church by the way you run church. If you run church so that the cold rationalist who's stunted emotionally gets uncomfortable with your experience of church, you'll build an even bigger church full of cold, stunted, emotionally immature people. I think we've got to push back on this. That we had Trevor at the Reach conference mentioned a lady who came to our church for the very first time.
Yeah.
And for her, the singing experience, because she heard people who really meant what they said and they sang, touched her in a deep way like she never thought it would. And we've got plumbers and builders and electricians and bullfeds, men who actually aren't demonstrable in these kinds of ways, but they get stirred by these things. I think we've got to be careful who we listen to.
So the change management exercise, you've got a church where you're wanting to see, the dial move on this, so to speak. So if you look at all the NCLS metrics, people aren't being inspired. If you look outwardly, there's not those externals being presented. How would you go about changing that? Because both of you have had it easy. You've been able to start your churches from the ground up, set the culture. You haven't had people coming in and shaping it. You've been able to shape it. What about for the person who comes into a culture where this is very foreign, very different? What advice would you give to them?
You have to teach it, of course, don't you? That's where it all happens, and then model it, and a lot of permission giving. But we still have to do it. I don't know with Andrew whether he was clear on this from the beginning, but I'm your Sydney Anglican, and then I remember 10 years in, we were at a high school. There was a fire, which for whatever reason we had to push all our songs up the front as a group, and we had to sing 2 or 3 together. And the band was resisting it like it was Pentecostal. So we decided this was because that would be manipulative if we just got people singing 2 or 3 songs together. So, hey, I had to still move the congregation. I don't think it's actually like it's arrived or anything. And I think a small percentage actually only, if you want to use hand movements still. But for me, as I mentioned in the article that you may or may not have read, when Wayne Burnett came to us years ago, and rated us 2 out of 4 in terms of singing. Wow, the music was, they were playing great, the songs were right, but he said, you guys aren't singing. And I felt like such a failure, because that was the bottom line, in that, like, if people aren't singing, and we're commanded to sing from the heart.
So he used the language of participation. So as he looked around, participation wasn't happening, which you had the element of performance,
Yeah.
but not participation.
Thank you for rubbing my nose into it even more. That's exactly right. And that was the mistake we've fallen into. It was the way the music was done. Part of that was slightly volume. Part of it, and they didn't learn to pull back sufficiently. But now they're learning to pull back and letting us sing sections of the song almost unaccompanied, so that we can, just a little bit more of that happening, and celebrating. Now, some people actually feel uncomfortable hearing their own voices, which is the opposite. And I said, but that's their problem. You got to get over that. You're called to sing. And can I say, we've had a number of people who've begun their testimonies with, when I came to church, you guys made me realize you believe what you're doing, because I could see it in your singing. It actually was the first step of thinking that we believe in a God who is living and loving and worth our praise. So yeah.
Can I want to sort of have a follow-up. A number of people have asked some questions, sort of some structural questions and some measure questions. So I want to go to the structural piece first. We've talked a lot about gatherings, and that being the high point, that being the champion structure for this area. What are some other, I guess, key inputs that go into the Godward attentiveness, Godward responsiveness purpose area?
Andrew?
Well, you've got we think of this area as bigger than just singing. So if we use the language, we call it that champion structure. So, growth groups are not the only vehicle for deep in the word, but it's our champion structure along with preaching. We want affections and an effective. The inputs there are, you can start moving into quite technical. Who are gifted in those areas, I nurture, encourage, and bring them along with us into it. That technical thing, I've not got to. In any change management, there's a future that could be very different and more wonderful. So there's your first big piece in changing things. Change is seeing that where we are is not as good as where we could be, and where we could be is very wonderful. So there's a big piece in change. Getting a group who are influential, who begin to have thought through this and aware of the dangers on either side and navigating it well. Making heroes of people that are champions in this area. So encouraging and cultivating people who actually express something of what you want to see expressed. Because I've been taught to be very suspicious of Pentecostal charismania, and my instinct is to keep shooting at it. And what I've learned is every time I take a shot at it, the person who is more demonstrative in this area hears that 10 times more loudly than I've thought it should be heard. So I think I've just said something in the midst of a whole lot of other positives, and it should just be recognised as a balance. But they've been devastated and crushed, and the end of them amongst us. And so we do need to pay attention to the volume of our critique of the dangers, which needs to be there. We need to critique the dangers, but need to do it with great care that the positive side of things is affirmed and encouraged and nurtured amongst me as a leader and a coalition of people who lead for it. We work hard at, I think Ray talked about this too, when our staff go away together, we'll sing. We want to incorporate sing, prayer, praise into everything we're doing as much as possible. Our team each year will have an occasion of repentance and heartfelt engagement of prayer together. These things matter. Just one little thing. I just think when we have public prayers, say amen or amen loudly. It's just such, I find it, just say amen and say it so that people around me can hear it. That's an external that's part of magnification in my mind. Yeah.
this is just just a conversation yesterday. One of the highlights in our gatherings is when we have open prayer. We do it. We want to do it every term at the end of a series and let people express what they've learned in thanksgiving to God. And you take a little bit of a risk, but nothing's really. I mean, one kid prayed for a dead animal, but apart from that, it was one of the highlight Sundays. The mic's open and people just go. I always say, just pray a short prayer of Thanksgiving of something, so you're kind of shaping it slightly, and just hearing from the congregation collectively, wow, that's always been one of the highlights.
So Ray, can I push into measures? You've talked already about surveying the whole congregation, and I'm presuming you're looking into each of the purpose areas as well. You've talked about the idea of performance and participation just as a way of thinking about the gathering. So performance there not being they performed great and everyone on stage looked great, but actually the flow of the service, the sound was at the right level, things kind of worked well. Participation side of things was more the singing culture. Are people externalizing, externally loving God? What are some other measures in this area, particularly given it's quite a fuzzy area and it's a hard area as well? How do you measure this?
Yeah, I probably don't have. My problem is I probably do it just intuitively and instinctively. But we have all the M pastors will speak to what happened on Sunday and send their feedback to the MAG pastor to get the MAG team to think it through. Now
this is really helpful where you've got a team and a team of people thinking into it. It's not just the guy who's been set aside to think about it. We've actually got everyone speaking into each other's area, which is not something I think we do well. And if you're in a small church, you could have non-staff members leading an area, but you as a senior minister or lead pastor actually creating that space for that conversation where you're actually feeding into each other's area is really important.
Review. That's the only way to do it, and have the right heads doing it. You got to watch it though; it can be crushing. So you've got to, especially me. I pick up on everything, and I've had to rebuke myself so many times. So the management of that, we're even trying to work out so we don't crush the MAG team, because creative people tend to be perhaps a touch more sensitive. I don't know, but their creativity allow. Sorry, that's a caricature. But anyway, I just want to say I say to the MAG guy, yours is the only ministry where everyone can see it every Sunday. I don't know what's going on in growth groups. They could be great or lousy, but your ministry is everyone can see it, and it attracts the most opinions with the strongest opinions, and from staff and the congregation. So nurturing, I reckon protecting them is as much important as giving feedback. And managing how you give the feedback, making sure that you haven't created an us and them experience, and dropping in. Vision rides on stories. So where do we want to be? Well, if you want to have a vision of where we want to be, then the way to get there is celebrate the stories that reflect that endpoint. So anytime someone gives us stories, we shoot it back to the MAG folk. And this was a response from someone who came to church, on the newcomers feedback form, and we send it to them so that they can be lifted up in the process.
So Ray, I know that in staff meeting every week you ask sort of two questions: who became a Christian on the weekend, and who is someone we should be investing in for leadership. What are your review questions for Sundays? And maybe Andrew, have you got some particular questions you kind of ask each week?
Yeah, we do the same. We always start with, has anyone been converted and so on. Just to underline a couple of things that Ray's offered there, we've got to protect people who work in this area because they're working usually in a culture that feels antithetical to what they want, what they're trying to do. So the culture already is heavy and somewhat critical. We've got to carefully look after them. Now we don't do. So we're a different context. Very early on, we would do as a small team this kind of review, but I found it always went it went sour quite often because what emerged was a lack of alignment over what we were trying to achieve. So I do think that I think Ray said it. there's a critical piece before you can properly do review. You all need to know what you're trying to achieve together.
Mm.
What actually is the outcome we're after here? Because otherwise, all you get is, someone just keeps saying, "I don't like that kind of thing," and someone else says, "I do like it," and you just get constant conflict that's unhelpful. So watching that, I think the alignment. I've talked a lot. We've done lots of conversations around this issue. In small team, big team, I've had weekends away preaching to it. I've had papers written on it. I've done a lot of communication around it, massive amount, because it's a big change management exercise. And I think we will always have this challenge because we're word people. We're not emotionalists people, and that'll always create for us a climate of challenge, I think.
Now, we've got a really good question. We've probably got time for one more question after this, depending on how long Ray gives the answer. But I'm at a small Anglican church in Tasmania. So Ben writes this from Tasmania, with mostly 70-plus-year-olds. They want traditional Anglican services. But to me, they feel inauthentic. And, I think these rituals do hold deep significance for some of them. I think Holy Communion moves them deeply in a way that ritual doesn't for me. And yet we need to reach the community, many of whom are retired. Could you share any advice you have about caring for the existing flock, challenging them, shifting our style? Really keen to hear both your reflections on this, because I know, Ray, you've just started a congregation in a retirement village.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So we moved. I inherited a congregation of 10 people at Rudy Hill when I took it over, and brought 150 with me into it. So we needed real estate, they needed people. I kept that group of 10, and then it kind of grew to 15 or 20 as a traditional Anglican service. I said, you exist to train my preachers. I was half serious, but it was a great place to experiment on without doing damage on the rest of the congregation. Well, they produce bishops, let's say, and general secretaries for the Presbyterian Church. So they've got a great CV. Now, we moved them to the retirement village, gave them a missional focus, and it's kind of, doubled in growth. And now we're getting feedback, it's too Anglican, and because we're getting people from other traditions coming in. Mm-hmm. And so it needed to be cut back. The liturgy was too heavy. And I said, introduce testimony. Let's see if we can sing a song that was written in the last 50 years, So just slowly, as well as having hymns, but still keeping the structure of the liturgy there. But if I was in Tasmania, the classic scenario is really start another service, really. You can move that. You've got to be a realist at some level, and you almost need to reform a new congregation. If the existing congregation, especially if you can bump them up slightly earlier, and you can start a family service with a contemporary liturgy that's going to be more accessible to more people.
There's some self-awareness in Ben's question as well, in the sense that here's what he holds dear, here's what he finds helpful, but actually recognizing there are other people who find this helpful as well. So there's a challenge always reconciling with your own, personal desires.
I never hated going to our 8 o'clock service and doing the prayer book, because I knew it was ministering to them. Like, it was a mode of, now I was afraid of the repetition and what, whether that was helpful or unhelpful. I had that question rolling around, but I knew it ministered to these people and they were edified by the liturgy. So I was more than happy. So it's not a right or wrong. Let's say in some foreseeable world that, people always say liturgies, they're going to be the next postmodern thing. I was never believing that one. I've never seen it as an effective thing. And I can see the dangers of fixed liturgy, but I generally, I start with what's edifying for this group of people. That's what we're always doing. So that what's the thing that's going to build them up in the faith? And if it's slightly more formal liturgy, you do that. But it's them and the people you want, to join them, I think, is where you're constantly asking that question, rather than a straight right or wrong.
Andrew, you got any reflections?
Oh, look, I agree. We've got a small 8 o'clock service here in our very large. We've got lots of very big services, but we've got a smaller smaller one because I knew that as we were aware that as we want to shift and change our bigger ones to have this dimension more, more modern, more effective and engaged, there was a group of people who simply would resist that. And when you're 75, you're not going to change profoundly. There's small changes you can make, but we run in a similar vein. It helps us though because people are different and they find it very emotionally engaging and satisfying for their cultural experience. I just work hard to teach both groups when this is not judgmentalism. Be careful, allow that people can be different. And what touches me emotionally about the truths of the gospel through the vehicle and form of singing a certain kind of song can be different for people. That's okay. But in the small town, the challenge there though is if you've got the resources to start a second service. That's that's part of the challenge. You need to watch those sacramentalism. So one of the problems in an older context, a small country town, is that communion can be a problem, actually. There's a great deal invested in it because that's their vehicle to enter the presence of God and find their sins cleansed, is this ritual. So there in itself could be an issue to wrestle with.
Well, Ray and Andrew, it's been really good hearing you talk, hearing your reflections on this topic. I'm looking forward to seeing some of the answers to the questions that we couldn't get to as well. For those who are listening in, excellent questions. It's been a really helpful conversation to have. We've still got more learning labs that are happening over the next few weeks. So if you want to register for those, go to reachaustralia.com.au/labs, LABS. Ray talked about having a consultation. If that's something that you think would be helpful for your church, one of the things we do in a consultation is a secret shopper visit. We actually visit the church and start paying attention to these things. Sometimes it's really helpful having a third party come in and see some of the things that you just don't see. Ray, you want to put your hand up on that one?
I had Jim Ramsey come in when we opened our building, and he walked through the whole experience, gave us a 4-page formal. We paid him to do it actually because we wanted it to be a proper thing. Wow, it exposed so many problems that we systematically worked our way through for the next year, from communication to welcoming to what we did in the gathering. It was, because you know what it's like, you get that bad, the mess in the foyer, you get used to it, and you need fresh eyes to say, you got a disgusting foyer.
Final thing just to mention is we've developed a course for Godward attentive pastors, MAG pastors, for those who are leading gatherings and leading this area. We've also developed a course for your team as well, an online course. So we'll be releasing that over the next few months. So be on the lookout for that. Can be a helpful resource for you as you seek to shape and give input into your teams as well. Well, looking forward to joining you in another Learning Lab. Chat soon.